Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Strange, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Cassidy, Collins, Donnelly, Ernst, Fisher, Heitkamp, Kennedy, Lee, McCaskill, Murkowski, Nelson, and Sass. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Baldwin, Barrasso, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Bozeman, Brown, Cantwell, Cochran, Corker, Cornyn, Cortez Masto, Daines, Duckworth, Durbin, Feinstein, Flake, Gillibrand, Graham, Harris, Hassan, Hatch, Heinrich, Hirono, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johnson, Kane, Langford, Leahy, Markey, McCain, McConnell, Merkley, Murphy, Murray, Paul, Perdue, Peters, Rounds, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Shelby, Strange, Tester, Tillis, Toomey, Udall, Warren, Whitehouse, Wicker, Wyden, and Young. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, Aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman.
Udall.
No.
Warren.
Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt. Aye. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner. No. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr. No. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch. Aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran. Aye. Mr. Heller. Mr. Heller. No. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts. No. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen. No. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz. Aye. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan. Aye. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley. No. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin. No. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito. Aye. Mr. King. Mr. King. Aye. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper. No. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin. Aye. Miss Stabenow. Miss Stabenow. Aye. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters. Aye. Miss Klobuchar. Miss Klobuchar. Aye. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Cotton. Aye. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Enzi. No. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune. No. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner. Aye. Mr. Heller. Mr. Heller.
Ryan.
Aye.
Doing any-
Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez.
Okay.
No. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott. No. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven. Aye. Mr. Reed, Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Casey, no. Mr. Franken, no.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to change their vote? If not on this vote, the yeas are 29, the nays are 71, 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn not having voted in the affirmative. The motion is not agreed to. The point of order is sustained and the amendment fails.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent that Senator Menendez be recognized to offer a motion to commit and that there be 2 minutes of debate equally divided prior to a vote on the motion.
Is there an objection? Without objection.
Mr. President, the Senate is not in order.
Senate will be in order. Senate will be in order. Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. President, I have a motion to commit at the desk.
The clerk will report the motion.
Senator from New Jersey, Mr. Menendez, moves to commit the bill H.R. 1 to the Committee on Finance with instructions to report the same back to the Senate in 3 days, not counting any day on which the Senate is not in session, with changes that, 1, are within the jurisdiction of such committee, and 2, would eliminate the repeal of the state and local tax deduction if state and local spending on investments and Medicaid and other health care infrastructure or services for children or seniors, education, or law enforcement is reduced or taxes on the middle class are increased.
Mr. President, I rise once again to stand up for the good people of New Jersey and other states to offer a motion to restore the state and local tax or SALT deduction. Ending the SALT deduction will subject millions of middle-class families to double taxation. But that's not all. It will also set the stage for huge cuts to education, law enforcement, infrastructure, public health, and other critical services. But don't take my word for it. Listen to the teachers and police officers, the doctors and nurses and firefighters. The National Education Association opposes it because it will hurt our public schools. The National Fraternal Order of Police and the National Sheriff's Association oppose it because it makes our streets less safe. The American Medical Association and the American Hospital Association oppose it because people will lose access to health care. The AARP opposes it because it will lead to cuts in Medicare and Medicaid and hurt our seniors. Even the New Jersey Chamber of Commerce opposes it because it will hinder investments in infrastructure businesses need to compete. My motion to commit would restore the SALT deduction if these all too predictable consequences happen. A corporate tax cut can't build a road, care for a senior, teach a child, or help keep our streets safe. And if corporations can keep the state and local tax deduction, so should middle-class families. We can't afford to roll the dice and risk these investments in the middle class. I urge adoption of the motion to commit, and I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Who yields time in opposition?
Mr. President.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. President, let's keep in mind that the state and local tax or SALT deduction disproportionately benefits wealthy taxpayers in high-tax states. More than 70% of American families currently take the standard deduction, so they're not even going to be impacted at all by this bill's treatment of SALT. But let's also keep in mind that our improving amendment strikes a compromise on SALT. It includes, as does the House bill, a deduction of up to $10,000 for property tax paid to state and local governments. Mr. President, Democrats insisting on keeping the entire SALT deduction in place should explain why they have prioritized a tax deduction for wealthy taxpayers over middle-class tax relief. Our bill addresses this issue in an appropriate way, and I urge my colleagues to vote against this motion. I yield back my time.
Question is on the motion. The yeas and nays were previously ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt. Sorry. Nancy, I got you. Gotcha, sir. Lee? Johnson? Mr. Booker? Mr. Bozeman? No. Yes, I did, thank you. Mr. Brown? Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Mr. Donnelly, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Lankford, Mr. Leahy, Sanders, Mr. Lee, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mrs. Shaheen. I did, thank you, thank you. Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Strange, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Cortez Masto, Donnelly, Duckworth, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Harris, Hassan, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hirono, Kane, King, King, Leahy, Markey, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Murray, Nelson, Peters, Reed, Sanders, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Udall, Van Hollen, Warren, and Wyden. Mr. Manchin. Aye. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Sass. Ms. Klobuchar. Aye. Mr. Murphy. Aye. Mr. Corker. Mr. Scott. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Capito, Cassidy, Cochran, Collins, Corker, Cornyn, Cotton, Crapo, Cruz, Daines, Enzi, Ernst, Fisher, Flake, Gardner, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Hoeven, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johnson, Kennedy, Lankford, Lee, McConnell, Moran, Murkowski, Paul, Portman, Roberts, Rounds, Rubio, Sass, Scott, Shelby, Strange, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Wicker, and Young. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Burr, no. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Perdue, no. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. McCain, no. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Schatz, aye.
Do any senators in the chamber wish to change their vote? Seeing none, if not, the yeas are 48, the noes are 52. The motion is not agreed to.
Mr. President.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. President, I'd ask unanimous consent that the following amendment be called up and reported by number: Cruz 1852, Kane 1846. Further, that following disposition of the Kane amendment, Senator Manchin be recognized to offer a motion to commit, and that there be 2 minutes of debate equally divided prior to the vote on the motion.
Is there objection? Without objection, the clerk will report the amendment.
Senator from Texas, Mr. Cornyn, four others, proposes amendments numbered 1852 and 1846 to amendment numbered 1618.
Who yields time?
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas is recognized.
Mr. President, tonight I ask your support for this common sense amendment, which will expand the already immensely popular 529 college savings plans so that parents can also save for K through 12 elementary and secondary school tuition, including educational expenses for homeschool students. This change will have real and significant effects. Your vote will expand options for parents and children spending their own money, and will prioritize the education of the next generation of Americans. By expanding 529s, which Americans already value greatly, we will help ensure that each child can receive an education that meets his or her individualized needs. And this reasonable expansion will enable that hardworking parents can better save for the educational future of their kids. This amendment was in the House bill, and it is fully paid for, and I urge your support.
Senators recognized.
Senator Cruz's amendment expands tax subsidies for upper-income householders to aid private or parochial schools by allowing 529 account balances to spend up to $10,000 a year on private or parochial school tuition and supplies. Colleagues, this is nothing less than a backdoor assault on the public K-12 education system. The real goal seems to be to take more and more children from the public schools and put them into private schools and shrink the funds that would be available for the public schools that give all of America's children the chance to get ahead. Members should oppose the amendment because it undermines America's public education system. I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Mr. Donnelly, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Strange, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Capito, Cochran, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Daines, Enzi, Ernst, Flake, Gardner, Graham, Hatch, Heller, Hoeven, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johnson, Kennedy, Langford, Manchin, Moran, Paul, Perdue, Risch, Roberts, Rounds, Rubio, Sass, Scott, Shelby, Sullivan, Toomey, and Wicker. Mr. Strange, aye. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Tillis, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Collins, Cortez Masto, Donnelly, Duckworth, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Harris, Hassan, Heitkamp, Hirono, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Leahy, Markey, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Reed, Sanders, Schatz, Shaheen, Tester, Warner, Warren, and Wyden. Mr. Udall, no. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Heinrich, no. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Ms. Stabenow, no. Mr. Peters, no. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. McCain, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Manchin, no. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Corker. Mr. Corker, aye.